think this is maybe something that we can dive in straight away, is that unfair shift that you talk about. Can you explain a little bit about what that means? How could that look like in the future?
Sure. So an anthro-shift originally, it's a social theory for social change around the environment. It was originally written by myself and Andrew Jorgensen, who's a colleague of mine who's at the University of British Columbia. We came up with this theory, which is all about how the different social actors, that is the state, the market, and civil society, which is you and me and all of us, general people in the public who may or may not be citizens who want to express ourselves and influence the way the world works, how we interact with one another when we're thinking about interacting around the environment. And so the anthro shift itself is talking about when there is this universal sense of risk. So that could be actual risk or perceived risk, and how that actually pushes for social change. After Andrew and I wrote the paper, I wrote a more recent paper that was called Anthro Shift in a Warming World, which was specifically taking this theory and applying it to climate change. And actually, that is what the book is building on, is this kind of more accessible piece that specifically uses the COVID pandemic to help us understand how much risk we have to feel to get the kind of lasting systemic changes that are needed. In the paper and in the book, what I talk about is how when the pandemic started, we all started to feel this, this threat that we might actually be at risk of getting sick, right? Or of passing a disease on to older people who could get sick, younger people, people who were immunocompromised. And as we started to feel more and more at risk that could happen, all of a sudden there was this window of opportunity that opened for making real change. And around the world, huge changes happened. Governments made very big decisions. Businesses made big decisions. We all decided to stay home. I mean, there were some laws in place about what we could and couldn't do, but we all made personal decisions too. I ended up homeschooling my kids for, over a year. We all, we didn't assemble for holidays, et cetera, and so forth. So the world changed quite substantially. So that was an anthro shift, right? This window of opportunity opened. What we see is this reorientation about the state, the market, and citizens interact with one another. But what we find in the theory of the anthro shift is that the world can change, but it's what we call multi-directional, which is that things can change and then they can change back. And there's some really good examples of this after extreme events, after disaster. And I think the pandemic provides a really great example, because what we basically see today is that the world has gone back in a lot of ways close to normal, to what it used to be. Most people don't wear masks anymore. Most people, go to public events again, right? Kids are back in school. So the world shifted back, but that helps us understand the degree to which we need to have a severe and durable sense of risk to get us to make the kind of changes that are necessary. Because, one of the reasons that we haven't really addressed the climate crisis at the level we need to and made these kinds of systemic changes that the scientists are saying are absolutely necessary is because we're going to feel them. It's not like an easy fix. There's no silver bullet. There's no just swap out one chemical for another and the world will go on moving the way it is. It's quite a substantial change to the way we live our lives. And as a result, people are, reluctant to do it. And states and, businesses are also reluctant to put into place the kinds of policies that are necessary to get us there.
Yeah. Whew, a lot there.
Was that too much? Sorry.
No. That's a lot to unpack, I think. Charlie, I saw you think a little bit there.
I think you're exactly right. And I think COVID really showed what can be done if there's an immediate risk. Mm-hmm. My fear is that climate change is going to be a bunch of isolated risks happening all over the planet. It's not going to be all of a sudden in the span of 3 months, it's like the whole world is faced with this thing. It's going to be droughts in Africa. It's going to be floods here. It's going to be rising sea levels here. And do you think that there's enough social awareness to push for the change that's needed? Or do you think it's just going to be a slow burnout over the next 100 years?
I think that's the $1 million question, Charlie. So basically, first and foremost, you're right. We're going to see these not necessarily isolated, but disconnected disasters that are going to happen simultaneously. Some of them will happen in different periods of time. Some of them will happen simultaneously. A lot of natural scientists are talking about these cascading disasters, which are becoming increasingly likely because of how the concentrations of, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are interacting with natural systems. And I am a social scientist, so that's not my world, but I believe and follow whatever the natural scientists say. So I know that that's possible, but I think that we have a couple of potential trajectories. I mean, one is we see isolated disasters. Like, for example, we saw this disaster that happened in Pakistan with the flooding, and a third of the population was severely affected. We may see that happening all over the world, but we will see these periods where disaster happens. And one of the things that I think makes me hopeful is the fact that from all the research I've done, we know that the kinds of social changes that are needed are most likely to come from the bottom up. So we're talking more local and regional policymaking. I don't believe that we're going to see a moment where internationally the climate regime is going to shift and all of a sudden create the kinds of top-down policies. Because even when the climate regime was going through the early, more optimistic period, in my perspective, we always knew that there was going to be national resistance to implementation from the top down. So I think even if that was feasible, it'd be very hard to implement, whereas coming from the bottom up is more likely. So one option is we see these windows of opportunity open at the regional and subnational levels around the world, where policymaking starts to change and we have more of this patchwork. I think that's very likely. Another option is that we see this cascading, that some of the natural scientists are predicting are coming quite soon, which means there'll be multiple disasters happening simultaneously around the world. And that will lead to, big national efforts coming up because so many nations are facing and struggling at the same time. The biggest challenge, I think, is that to get to that point, the question is, how far gone are we going to be where the window of opportunity opens wide enough? Because if we wait that long, where there is so many disasters taking place simultaneously, which is quite possible, how much will be lost and how far gone will we be? I mean, as I talk about in the book, there's no question that lives are going to be lost. Lives are being lost right now to the climate crisis, and more lives are definitely going to be lost as the world warms. The question is how many lives, how many regions will become uninhabitable, how many coastal communities will be flooded out, how many small island states will be underwater before we actually take the hard steps that are needed to save ourselves. And so I think those are the big questions right now.
Mm-hmm. So there's one quote. It's, "If I do it right, my predictions will scare you, but they should also give you hope." You've been at this for a long time. You've seen the progress or the lack of progress in the past 25 years. What are the main obstacles for not having any change, or no drastic change yet?
Well, the obstacles, and actually I was heartened to find with the IPCC, this most recent round, that we finally started talking about fossil fuel interests, because that's the obstacle. Those who have gotten wealthy off of burning fossil fuels, and it's not just oil companies, not just coal companies, it's not just natural gas companies. There are many other petrochemical companies, plastic producers, et cetera, and so forth, who benefit from the extraction and burning and processing of fossil fuels, right? The carbon-based energy sources, they are what we were required to call in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent assessment report. We ended up having to call them vested interests. Those are the fossil fuel interests. Those are the ones that are making money right now, burning and extracting and expanding our demand for fossil fuels. And that is the hindrance. It comes from the market sector, right? These are businesses. But they are all amazingly interconnected with our decision-making processes at this point. I mean, in the United States and many other countries, we see fossil fuel interests holding a lot of what we call privileged access to power. In the United States, it's through the fact that a lot of fossil fuel interests fund political campaigns on both the left and right. That is, both Republicans but also Democrats have been funded in part by fossil fuel interests. And one of the things that we find when we do analysis about voting behavior is you can explain voting behavior better when you look at who funds the campaigns rather than what political party they have. So it's those who take fossil fuel money tend to vote against climate policy making and addressing the climate crisis at the level needed, even if they say they care about climate change. And so that is absolutely the number one hindrance to getting us to the other side of the climate crisis and to the kinds of risks that we're feeling now, opening up windows of opportunity.